Found her sitting in the middle of the room.
What is it about ritual movies or movies about rituals that is really so fascinating? I mean, is it because there's the idea that there is this world that lives kind of just beyond ours, or is it the fact that there are these conduits where if done correctly, we have a way of tapping into that world? I don't know. From Black is a 2023 movie about a former drug addict who had lost her son 7 years prior, and so she participates in a ritual to try and get him back. Now, this movie, man, it really teetered on the edge for me, where it kept opening the door for what could have been a great horror movie, but it just never quite fully was able to walk through it. I mean, now, there are some really well done elements in this film, but it just never fully committed to the characters into that dark, kind of uncomfortable place that I thought it needed to go for those elements to kind of really take off. The movie opens in a way that seems to have really gotten popular in, say, maybe the last 10 years or so, which is that it starts at the end with the crime scene as a cold open, and then the bulk of the movie takes place kind of leading up to that. Now, as a device, like I don't mind when it's done well, but it always kind of disappoints me a little bit because in my mind it kind of gives away some spoilers and can kind of undermine the tension a little bit later on. But if done well, like it can end up being like a bit of a red herring, or it can just sort of enhance the level of curiosity as to sort of how these things ended up happening. However, after the opening crime scene where the sheriff, Bray, walks through the house with these various ritualistic elements and very bloody imagery kind of plastered throughout, we learn that the sheriff's sister, Cora, was the occupant of the house and then taken into custody. She was the one who called the police in the first place, and she is clearly in distress and covered in blood. Bray is now tasked with finding out what happened to her. And this is sort of where I feel like the movie chose the wrong protagonist. And I'll kind of get into a little bit more specifics later on. But the way this movie starts out, it feels like the sheriff is going to be the character that we follow throughout the movie. And in some ways, I kind of think it should have been. But instead, once Cora starts telling her story, the rest of the movie is just sort of told in flashbacks with a couple little jumps back to the present so that Bray can kind of be upset and just not understand what's going on. What is going on is Cora is a drug addict, or former drug addict. Although I think one of the tenets of addiction is you're always a drug addict, just in recovery. Anyway, at one point, she was a heavy user with her boyfriend, and that resulted in her 5-year-old boy going missing. This devastated her, and it led her to kind of get clean and seek help. She's been going to these group meetings every week with others who have also lost people close to them for the past 7 years or so. This group is run by a man named Abel who also lost his daughter several years prior. Cora is in a rough spot. I mean, she's trying to get her life back together and cope with this tragedy, but she just can't seem to get past it. I mean, she keeps thinking things will get better, but they just don't for her. Ultimately, she ends up deciding that she no longer wants to attend this particular group. This could have been a bit more of a defining moment for her and her decision, but unfortunately, it doesn't dive into her character as much as I think it should have been to make this an important point. Her decision to kind of leave the group is more of a circumstantial one than an important one. And this kind of gets back to the protagonist problem that I mentioned earlier. I really think it needed to just get into her head more throughout the course of this story. Like what is her alternative to this group? Like, what was her decision to leave? When Abel shows up at her door and asks her why she left, she doesn't seem to really have any answers or a plan on what to do after leaving. And I just think it would have gone a long way of sort of understanding where she was at if we knew some of these things. I don't know, perhaps that she was contemplating suicide or going back on drugs, and we kind of see her hanging around these old drug spots. Just something that really showed how much that she was actually drowning. And that if Abel hadn't come along, her character would have spiraled into a very dark place, which would have upped the stakes for the lifeline that he's trying to give her. That lifeline is her son back. Now, he tells her that a woman approached him just like he's doing for her, and she performed this ritual that brought his daughter back. He proposes that if she is willing to do whatever it takes to get her son back, he'll do the ritual with her. She ends up agreeing to do the ritual, but this once again is kind of getting into a situation of switched characters. Now, she agrees to do the ritual, but then she seems very skeptical, and even when presented with some evidence that it's working, has to kind of constantly be coaxed and reassured that she's doing the right thing and to press on by Abel. And to be fair, there is a reason that's revealed for Abel to be doing all this and to be pushing this forward, but that happens far later in the movie. So for a lot of the movie, I kept getting kind of frustrated that she doesn't seem to really want to do this ritual. And in my eyes, she should be the driving force of this thing, like trying to convince Abel to keep going to really show how desperate she is of getting her son back.
We reject the natural order and remove ourselves from the spiritual covering of light.
But the way it stands now, she talks a big game about wanting her son and making amends, etc., but it isn't really followed up by her actions much. She never seems to go far enough and is constantly let off the hook for only going halfway. Okay, to go any further, I'm going to have to get into a little bit of spoilers here, so if you don't want to hear this, skip ahead. As this ritual commences and goes further and further, Cora is visited by this creature/demon that ends up showing her the true fate of her son, which is horrific, and makes her experience that horror and pain and suffering all over again. Now, this is all part of the ritual, and now because of this, she has to strike a deal with this creature in order to actually get her son back. And this sets up the last act of the film. Now, this is also where the frayed edges of the film really kind of show through. Like the creature demon, whatever you want to call it, it almost acts like a Cenobite, like kind of lifted from the Hellraiser movie, where it has a clear agenda and rules that it's trying to follow. Thankfully, it's not just some sort of exorcist-type demon that is just kind of out for blood and carnage. However, the details of the deal are kind of largely confusing. I mean, at one point it says it needs a vessel, but when presented with one, it turns it down because it says it's not suitable. And although it doesn't seem to get what it wants, it still continues to give her chance after chance after chance. Once again, never really pushing her character to the edges. Like basically, everything just seems to sort itself out for her as opposed to because of her. And in the end, I still don't really understand what the final deal was that was made. I mean, the demon creature says that he would never take a boy away from his mother, but something has to be given in order to get the boy back. And there's no indication that something was if it wasn't her. I just don't understand what the creature is kind of getting out of all this. Now, Abel does reveal that the point of the ritual is to pass the demon along from host to host, and that's part of the price of the gift. But there doesn't appear to be much of a downside. And it would seem that the demon would have to have her as the vessel. So asking for a vessel or her offering up a vessel besides her doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because I still don't know what she gave up. Ultimately, she seems to never have to fully commit to anything. Like she doesn't have to kill the goat, she doesn't have to drink the blood, she doesn't have to complete the ritual, she doesn't really have to perform any sort of morally questionable acts that would make sense as part of the deal, but yet she ends up getting her son back anyway. Now, during all of this, we sort of routinely go back to the present where Bray is struggling with the stories that Cora is telling her. I mean, she lashes out to her girlfriend, she tries to make sure that Cora's former druggy boyfriend is out of the picture, and this is why I would have preferred if Bray was the main character and it was her story that we were following, and the flashbacks are more of these disjointed story bits of her putting it together throughout the ramblings of her sister, which I think would have allowed for that unreliable narrator element later on for any sort of reveals or twists in the story. I mean, To see a crazy story filtered through a rational person like the sheriff who has emotional ties to Cora, I think would have grounded everything in a sense of dread that I just feel is missing here. If they wanted Cora to be the focus, why not just do a straight story of Cora's circumstance? Like, as of now, this sort of halfway approach is really just a story told by Cora, who we know is alive. Like, we could remove the sister and the framing device and told it linearly, and the story would be largely the same. So why kind of have any of that? Despite all that, this movie does really work in both its atmosphere and setting, and I give it a lot of credit for how it looks and feels. It's solidly executed, it's paced well, it has some stunning imagery. The creature/demon design effects are fantastic. Although I would argue that the creature probably talks a little bit too much and it ends up losing a bit of its gravitas because of it. But it's not a killer. I have mentioned before how I don't like too much music in movies. There seems to be music for literally every single moment in the film. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's great music, but even great music becomes white noise if it never stops. I mean, I think a few more moments of silence would have really upped the ante a bit. The performances are mostly good. I mean, I did find Anna Camp's performance a little uneven at times, but given the problems I mentioned with the character in general being uneven, I put more onus of that on the director, and maybe that's just how he wanted the character to be, because usually she's a really good actor. Finally, I didn't love the framing device of the flashbacks. I mean, I think it robbed the story of some tension, especially since it ended up not really figuring into the full story by the end. But overall, this movie succeeds more than it fails. I'd give it a B, but let me know what you think.